Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions will come to order. This has been a shortened week, so I think you're going to see there are hearings taking place all over the place, and I think you're going to see senators drifting in and out. But I want to thank all of our panelists for being with us. This morning, we are going to be talking about an issue that is very rarely discussed in the halls of Congress or the Senate, and that is the need to reduce the standard work week in the United States. In fact, the last time, as we understand it, the Senate held a hearing on this subject was in the year 1955. So I think maybe the time is now to renew that discussion. At that hearing, the Senate heard from Walter Reuther, who was at that point, the head of the United Auto Workers and the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and Reuther is regarded as one of the great labor leaders of his time. And this is what Walter Reuther said at that time. He said, quote, "We fully realize that the potential benefits of automation are great, if properly handled. If only a fraction of what technologists promise for the future is true, within a very few years, automation can and should make possible a 4-day work week. The reduction of the work week to 35 or 30 hours in the coming decade can be an important shock absorber during the transition to the widespread use of automation. It can both reduce the impact of sharp rises in output and increase the manpower requirements in industry and commerce." End of quote. And yet today, nearly 70 years later, despite an explosion, as we all know, in technology and a massive increase in worker productivity, nothing has changed. Think about that. Think of the huge transitions we have seen in the economy, but in terms of the work week, nothing has changed. While we have not discussed this issue for a long time in Congress, this is not, needless to say, a new issue. In 1886, one of the central planks of the trade union movement in America was to establish an 8-hour work day with a simple and straightforward demand, quote, 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what you will, end quote. That was back in 1886. Americans of that era were sick and tired of working 12-hour days for 6 or 7 days a week with very little time for rest, relaxation, or quality time with their families. They went out on strike, they organized, they petitioned the government and business owners, and they achieved real results after decades of struggle. In 1916, President Woodrow Wilson signed legislation into law to establish an 8-hour workday for railroad workers. 6 years later, the Ford Motor Company became one of the first major employers in America to establish a 5-day work week for auto workers. And here is something I believe that most people in our country do not know. In 1933, the United States Senate overwhelmingly passed legislation to establish a 30-hour work week by a vote of 53 to 30. That was 1933. While that legislation ultimately failed as a result of intense opposition from corporate America, a few years later, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the Fair Labor Standards Act into law, and a 40-hour work week was established in 1940. My friends, in 1940. Unbelievably, 84 years later, despite massive growth in technology and worker productivity, millions of workers in our country are working longer hours for low wages. And I hope people hear this, because it's not an issue we talk about enough. Today in America, 28.5 million Americans, 18% of our workforce, now work over 60 hours a week, and 40% of employees in America now work at least 50 hours a week. We were talking about a 40-hour work week 80 years ago, and that's what people today, despite the explosion of technology, are working. The sad reality is Americans now work more hours than the people of any other wealthy nation. And we're going to talk about what that means to the lives of ordinary people. In 2022, employees in the United States, and I hope people hear this, logged 204 more hours a year than employees in Japan, and they're hardworking people in Japan. 279 more hours than workers in the United Kingdom, and 470 more hours than workers in Germany. Despite these long hours, the average worker in America makes almost $50 a week less than he or she did 50 years ago after adjusting for inflation. Now let that sink in for a moment. Think about all of the extraordinary changes in technology that we have seen over the last 50 years. Computers, robotics, artificial intelligence, and the huge increase in worker productivity that has been achieved during that time. In factories and warehouses, robots and sophisticated machinery did not exist then, or were only used in primitive forms. In grocery stores and shops of all kinds, there were no checkout counters that utilized barcodes. As a result of the extraordinary technological transformations that we have seen in recent years, American workers are now over 400% more productive than they were in the 1940s. Extraordinary. Technology has made working people far more productive. And what has been the result of all of that productivity increase for working people? Almost all of the economic gains of that technological transformation have gone straight to the top, while wages for workers have remained stagnant or even worse. While CEOs today are making 350 times as much as their average employees, workers throughout the country are seeing their family life fall apart as they are forced to spend more and more time at work. They're missing their kids' birthday parties, little league, baseball games, and just the time they need with their family. And what stresses them out even further is that after spending all of this time at work, many of them still are living paycheck to paycheck, can't take care of their basic needs. At a moment in history when artificial intelligence and robotics, and I hope we all understand that the jobs that people have today ain't going to be there in many cases in 15 years. Our economy is going to be transformed through artificial intelligence and robotics. The question that we are asking today is a pretty simple question. Do we continue the trend that technology only benefits the people on top, or do we demand that these transformational changes benefit working people? And one of the benefits must be a lower work week, 32-hour work week. This is not a radical idea. France, the 7th largest economy in the world, has a 35-hour work week and is considering a 32-hour work week. Norway and Denmark is about, their work week is about 37 hours, and Belgium has already adopted a 4-day work week. And what we're going to hear today is there are companies all over our country and all over the world that have adopted the 40-hour work week. You know what they found? They found that productivity actually went up because workers were able to focus on their work. They were not exhausted. They were happy to go to work. So the issue that we are talking about today is of enormous importance. Who benefits from the exploding technology? The wealthiest people who are doing phenomenally well, or working people who are falling behind? And with that, let me give the mic over to Senator Cassidy.
Thank you, Chair Sanders. Thank you, Chair Sanders. A 32-hour work week with no loss in pay. My staff has volunteered to be the test case for that. I mean, like, who wouldn't want it? It's free money, if you will. No loss in pay, but you work a lot less. But in reality, there is no free lunch. Workers will be the ones who would pay, not get paid extra. The government mandating a 32-hour work week requiring businesses to increase pay at least an extra 25% per hour would, frankly, destroy some employers. They would ship those jobs overseas, or they would automate to replace those workers for whom they have an increased expense, or they would dramatically increase prices to make this stay afloat. Now, we've talked about the Biden economics leading to inflation. This would be napalm upon the fire of inflation. If this policy is implemented, it would threaten millions of small businesses operating on a razor-thin margin because they're unable to find enough workers. Now they've got the same workers, but only for 3/4 of the time, and they have to hire more. In fact, there's even an incentive for them to dip down so they make everybody part-time, and then they don't have to pay certain penalties which are certain requirements which are required for full-time. Now, if a business wants to voluntarily try a 32-hour work week for themselves, federal law allows it. We don't have to mandate. And we will hear from a business today that does that. So if an employer thinks it's good for their business, makes it more competitive, go for it. We think that's a good thing. But by the way, I'll note that the chair has not done that with his staff. Why? Because there's a certain amount of work required for the continuity of the work. That's just basic. Now, if a business needs to maintain a 40-hour work week to remain competitive, not just locally but globally, a government-mandated 32-hour work week would be catastrophic. Government should not be in the business of undermining an employer's ability to keep their doors open with unreasonable and perhaps unconstitutional mandates. Now, the chair frequently says the United States is the wealthiest nation in the world. We are. How do we achieve it? American work ethic, second to none. And we have a balance. We don't have people, as they do in China, working 80 hours a week, but we have that balance. This disrupts that balance. And we won't maintain the status of being the world's wealthiest nation if we kneecap the American economy with something which purports to be good for the American worker, but indeed will lead to offshoring of jobs seeking for a lower cost labor force. Now, there is a reason that no other country has a mandatory 32-hour work week. When Japan shortened its work week from 46 to 30 hours between 1988 and 1996, economic output plummeted 20%. Belgium, as the chair notes, has a 4-day work week, but those workers work 40 hours within those 4 days. Now, AI and other technologies have the potential to dramatically increase economic productivity. I think we should have a bipartisan hearing on the potential impact of AI on the American economy. If we have this, my gosh, I am ecstatic. And I see one of, Dr. Schor, you're nodding your head yes. We're simpatico on this. We need to explore it. My office published a white paper and an RFI to stakeholders last year on how this committee should approach AI and the impacts upon health, education, and labor. And we're working on next steps based upon that feedback. But a mom and pop restaurant is not really seeing increased productivity from AI. They're having trouble finding enough people to fill shifts. And if we require them to pay for a 40-hour work week for 32 hours of work, how will it turn out for that mom and pop restaurant? Hospital staffing shortages, we've talked about that. Threatening public health. Well, why are we passing a law to exacerbate that shortage? UAW pushed for a 32-hour work week. It didn't happen. But now I don't think the federal government should mandate it, frankly, just to kind of placate a Democratic political base. Frankly, this seems as an exercise to try and help the UAW lay the groundwork for future negotiations. If the UAW wishes to discuss this, we should do so they should do so at the bargaining table. Now, by the way, I apologize if this hearing gives anyone false hope, but a mandatory 32-hour work week is bad policy. I'll note not even Democrats unanimously support this. But it may give us an understanding where the Biden administration is heading. They're up for a tough re-election, and they may be more than willing to use executive authority to do something which actually has bipartisan opposition. And there's been a concerning pattern from Democrats of prioritizing policies to help politically connected unions at the expense of the workers and businesses, themselves. Recently, the Biden administration proposed a new overtime rule, dramatically increasing overtime pay threshold by 55%. That will result in layoffs, and it will result in more inflation. The Biden administration released a new joint employer rule, threatening the viability of the franchise model that employs over 9 million workers and has empowered people who had a dream of becoming a small business person to become a small business person and otherwise would not have. The Department of Labor's new independent contractor rule jeopardizes the ability of 27 million Americans to work as independent contractors. with the flexibility to pick their own hours and work for multiple businesses, and this being attractive, but their independence and protection from forced unionization has made restricting this freedom a top priority for unions. The administration's assault on workers' flexibility and employers via rulemaking is unacceptable. These policies hurt the American worker and, by the way, contribute to inflation. As I said, I would have been excited to work with the chair on a hearing to discuss the impact of AI and the new technologies in our jurisdiction. There is very strong bipartisan interest in examining this issue. But we are working instead upon a bill which will never pass Congress and will be detrimental for American workers. With that, I yield.
Thank you. We have a very knowledgeable panel, and we thank all 5 panelists for being with us today. We're going to begin with Shawn Fain. Mr. Fain is the international president of the United Automobile Workers. He is a 29-year member of the UAW and got his start with the union as an electrician at Chrysler Kokomo casting plant. Recently, he led the UAW in negotiating an historic contract which substantially raised wages and benefits for the workers of that union. Mr. Fain, thanks for being with us.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Sanders, Dr. Cassidy, and members of the committee. I'm here to talk about one of the most important issues to any union leader and any working class person, any U.S. senator, and any human being, and that's our time. You know, as president of the United Auto Workers, I represent 400,000 working class people and 600,000 retirees. And I know when my members look back on their lives, they never say, I wish I would have worked more. When people reach the end of their lives, they never say, I wish I'd have made more money. What they wish for is they wish they had more time. And that's what work does. You know, work, we are paid for our time. And when we work, we are sacrificing time with other people, with family, friends, and other things we wish to do. You know, but time, just like every precious resource in our society, is not freely given to the working class. Since the Industrial Revolution, we've seen productivity in our society skyrocket. With the advance of technology, one worker is now doing what 12 workers used to do. More profit is being squeezed out of every hour, every minute, and every second. There was a time when this phenomenon was supposed to lead to workers getting their time back, getting some of their lives back. Nearly 100 years ago, economist John Maynard Keynes spoke of the future of workers' time. His worry that was with all the gains in productivity, we wouldn't know what to do with ourselves, and he predicted a 15-hour work week 100 years ago. You know, in my own union, I go back into our archives and I read about the fight for the 30-hour work week, an idea that was alive and well with our union back in the 1930s and 40s. But today, deep in the 21st century, we find these ideas unimaginable. Instead, we find workers working longer hours. We have workers working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. There are workers, not union or not, working multiple jobs. And they're living to work, and they're scraping to get by, and they're living paycheck to paycheck. You know, we find workers today, later in their life, working deep into their 60s, 70s, and 80s because they can't afford to retire. And we find associated deaths of despair from addiction and suicide, of people who don't feel a life of endless, hopeless work is a life worth living. You know, we have workers who feel despair as a consequence of advances in technology. Workers have been sacrificed at the altar of greed, and they've been stripped of their dignity. We have a mental health crisis we talk about a lot in this country, but we never talk about the causes of that. You know, there's been studies done. You know, increases in stress from working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, you're sacrificing family life, things you want to pursue. It causes an increase in cortisol levels, which lead to heart disease, cancer, strokes. You know, but given all those facts, if someone is lucky enough to get to retire, typically when they've worked themselves to death their entire life, they face knee replacements, hip replacements, shoulder surgeries, and the rest of their lives figuring out how they're going to survive. So, you know, it's sad to say that in 1933, the U.S. Senate passed legislation to establish a 30-hour work week, but due to intense corporate opposition, that legislation failed. But in 1940, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the Fair Labor Standards Act, establishing a 40-hour work week. 84 years ago, the 40-hour week was established. And since then, we've had a 400% increase in productivity, but nothing's changed. You know, that was why we had in our Big Three campaign, we had our stand-up strike. We raised the flag for a 32-hour work week. This isn't just a union issue, contrary to what some people want to talk about. This is a working class issue. And that's why 75% of Americans in our contract fight stood with us in that fight, because they're all living the same reality. You know, who's going to act to fix this epidemic of lives dominated by work? Are the employers going to act? Will Congress act? You know, how can working class peoples take back their lives and take back their time? And I know what people, and many in this room will say. They'll say, people just don't want to work, or working class people are lazy. But the truth is, working class people aren't lazy, they're fed up. They're fed up with being left behind and stripped of dignity as wealth inequality in this nation, this world spirals out of control. They're fed up that in America, 3 families have as much wealth as the bottom 50% of citizens in this nation. That is criminal. America is better than this. So I want to close with this. I agree there is an epidemic in this country of people who don't want to work. People who can't be bothered to get up every day and contribute to our society, but instead want to freeload off the labor of others. But those aren't blue-collar people. Those aren't working class people. It's a group of people who are never talked about for how little they actually work and produce and how little they contribute to humanity. The people I'm talking about are the Wall Street freeloaders, the masters of passive income. Those who profit off the labor of others have all the time in the world, while those who make this country run, the people who build the products and contribute to labor, have less and less time for themselves, for their families, and for their lives. So our union's going to continue to fight for the rights of working class people to take back their lives and take back their time. And we ask you to stand up with the American workers and support us in that mission. Thank you.
President Fain, thank you very much. Our next witness is Dr. Juliet Schor. She's an economist and professor of sociology at Boston College. Dr. Schor is a lead researcher for 4-day week global trials of companies instituting 4-day weeks with 5 days pay. She has been researching work time since the 1980s and is the author of the best-selling book, The Overworked American. Dr. Schor, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Sanders, Dr. Cassidy, and members of the committee. I'm honored to have this opportunity to support the 32-Hour Workweek Act. We're here today because for 84 years, there's been no reduction in the standard work week. Since 1950, the productivity of the American worker has risen by 400%, yet full-time employees still log an average of 41.9 hours a week. Annual hours even rose in the 1990s and have barely changed since then. These trends depart from the steady reduction in hours between 1870 and World War II and from trends in other wealthy countries. The average American is on the job 400 more hours a year than in Germany, 200 more than in France, the Netherlands, the UK, and more than the average Japanese. This is despite the US historically being the global leader in work time reduction and the world's first 5-day week country. Now, this was the situation when the pandemic hit, which brought with it extraordinary levels of stress and burnout, the Great Resignation, and historically high job vacancies. In response, an increasing number of employers are shifting to a 4-day, 32-hour week with no reduction in pay. I was asked to lead research on their experiences in collaboration with an NGO called 4-Day Week Global. To date, more than 300 companies around the world have taken part in our trials. While the majority are white-collar firms, they do include all sectors: healthcare, mom-and-pop restaurants, manufacturing, construction, retail, nonprofits, IT, finance, professional services, and even a police department in Golden, Colorado. In the U.S., 78% of these are small businesses with 50 or fewer employees, which is similar to the U.S. economy. Our results have been extremely positive for both workers and the companies. We have 26 well-being measures for more than 3,600 employees, every one of which registers improvement from baseline to the end of the trial. Nearly 60% of employees experience better work-family balance. Anxiety, sleep problems, fatigue, physical and mental health improve for 40% of workers. 69% of employees have lower burnout scores. Participants tell us that the new schedule is, quote, life-changing. One person reports that had it not been for the pilot, I wouldn't have had the time or the availability to get medical appointments and procedures, which ultimately led to the early detection of something that might have proved fatal. That something was cancer. In our statistical modeling, we find that the larger the work time reduction, the greater the increase in well-being. Fewer sleep problems and less fatigue are one reason. But the second is that a majority of employees register an increase in their productivity over the trial. They are more energized, focused, and capable, partly as a result of organization-wide changes in work culture and processes. In response to methodological criticism, I will just say here that our findings are robust across time, across place, and industry, and contain a large number of variables to rule out alternative explanations. For employers, the most important number is 91%. That's the fraction of companies who have continued with the 4-day week after at least one full year. In the US and Canada, only 2 companies have gone back to a 5-day schedule. Their performance metrics reveal why. Resignations fell 22%. Absenteeism declined 39%. Revenue increased an average of 30%. Some companies report that quality of service improves. After losing 50% of their inpatient nurse leaders during the first 2 pandemic years, Temple University Hospital gave them a 4-day week. Patient outcomes improved and voluntary turnover fell to 0. If the U.S. adopts a 4-day week, a 32-hour week, it is likely that hourly productivity will rise. That has been the experience of both workers and management in our trials. It is historically what scholars have concluded from past reductions in work time. And it accords with international comparisons. The countries with the highest levels of per-hour productivity are those with the shortest working hours. I began my remarks by referencing our 4-fold increase in productivity. The fact that so little of that productivity increase has been put toward reducing hours has left American workers suffering from burnout and stress, with families in special jeopardy. The pandemic exacerbated this pre-existing problem. Given the current robust rates of U.S. productivity growth, the promise of further large increases from artificial intelligence, and the fact that over the last 84 years the standard work week has been unchanged, it is now time for a 32-hour week. Thank you.
Dr. Schor, thank you very, very much. Our next witness is John Leland, the Chief Strategy Officer at Kickstarter and co-founder of the nonprofit WorkFour. Mr. Leland successfully introduced 4-day work week at his company in 2022, and in his nonprofit work supports employers, unions, and policymakers advancing the 32-hour work week. Mr. Leland, thanks for being with us.
Good morning, Chairman Sanders, Dr. Cassidy, and members of the committee. As the Chief Strategy Officer at Kickstarter, I bring a unique perspective to this panel, having both implemented and experienced a 4-day work week in our company of 118 employees. Our journey began during the pandemic, a period that completely upended traditional work norms and demonstrated just how ingrained and potentially outdated some of our assumptions are around work. But the pandemic also clarified that the time we have with our families and loved ones is the most valuable thing that we have. Kickstarter is a data-driven company, and we were initially driven by repeated studies and success stories demonstrating that a 4-day workweek could benefit both businesses and employees. We also recognized some common sense around how a 4-day workweek could work. Hours worked is a factor in productivity, but it is not determinative. Efficiency, focus, and employee retention are all equally or more critical. And people are tired. Workers are already finding ways to rest at work. They are surfing the internet, they are just slowing down, they are stepping away just to get the energy to get through the workday. I'd rather just give people back their time so they can properly rest. In April 2022, we initiated a 6-month pilot. Our goal was to maintain or improve overall productivity. And to do that, the bargain we made with our employees was simple. They would get back an extra day every week, retaining the same salary, the same benefits, and in exchange, we expected them to manage their time effectively, show up to work every week, rested and ready to go, and get the job done. We were not going to scale back our ambitions or our goals to accommodate the 4-day workweek. And the results of our pilot were clear. Our goal achievement rate soared from 62% to 95%. Customer response times and satisfaction ratings stayed the same. Employee retention increased from 82% to 98%, all while reducing average weekly working hours by 9 hours a week for each employee. We made the decision to stick with the 4-day workweek and have kept it for 2 years. The most profound change, however, has been the impact to our employees. In just 2 years, we've been able to return nearly 10,000 days to our 118 employees. That's more than 27 years. Those are years of spending time with family and their children, volunteering in their communities, learning new skills, and taking care of their health. The value of that time is priceless and ultimately has been the greatest outcome of our transition to a 4-day workweek. The 5-day workweek is not an immutable law of nature. It was not written on the tablets. It was established 84 years ago here in the US. Critics of the 5-day workweek back then also predicted doom. They worried that a weekend would destroy the American economy. Instead, it helped launch us to the front of the global pack. Entire industries of recreation and leisure were born. The American middle class became the envy of the world. And the weekend became the time when families and communities came together. With a century of profound changes in our workforce and technology, with AI looming on the horizon, it is time for a much needed update. The studies echo what we learned at Kickstarter, that when piloted, the 4-day workweek works. All 35 North American companies that piloted the 4-day workweek with us in 2022 have kept it. If it didn't work, for-profit companies would abandon it. You don't need theories or advanced data. You just need to see that the companies that pilot this tend to stick with it. This is not just tech companies either. These are manufacturing companies, healthcare facilities, restaurants, and police departments that are making this transition. This is a shift that can and must benefit all workers in our society. That is why the bill introduced by the chairman is so important. It would ensure that we are defining a new standard for our workweek that benefits all workers in our economy, not just the most privileged. With the opportunity we have now, it's important to ensure that all American workers in our communities reap the dividends. The 4-day workweek is an issue backed by data that Americans of all stripes in poll after poll say matters to them. Before us is the opportunity to deliver a boost to our economy and happiness to every American worker, to strengthen American families and communities. The original weekend did just that, and it's time to do it again.
Mr. Leland, thanks very much. Senator Cassidy, do you want to introduce your witnesses?
Please, first, Dr. Liberty Vittert, is a professor of the practice of data science at the Olin Business School at WashU in St. Louis. She's a senior fellow at Harvard University and MIT researcher, on-air statistician for News Nation, TOO's Discovery Channel shows, and analyzes and calls elections for Decision Desk HQ, and is featured in a number of publications, has a great resume for academics. But what is most interesting about Dr. Vittert is that she studied at Le Cordon Bleu. So we actually have someone here who knows how to cook something more than pancakes, which, no offense, I'm sure others do as well. Anyway, so you would call it a crepe. Anyway, so we're pleased to have you.
Cookies for the group. Chairman Sanders, Dr. Cassidy, Senator Hickenlooper, thank you so much for having me here today. I am a statistician, and we have heard a lot of statistics thrown around. So I'm here to make some sense of these and make sure we're analyzing them properly. Proponents of the 32-hour work week often point to statistical studies, mostly pilots, that suggest shorter work weeks can lead to increased productivity and improved employee well-being. But this argument is making broad claims based upon weak and statistically flawed data sets. A closer look at some of the most popularly cited studies reveals significant flaws and limitations. We'll take a brief look at some of these studies to understand these statistical flaws and shed significant and potentially insurmountable doubt on the proposal's sustainability in the American work economy. Many of the news headlines touting these studies discuss the stress or happiness levels of workers who work less time. Inevitably, over the short term in these short pilot projects, it's not inconceivable to imagine that happiness levels increase. The question is, where does the pendulum end? At no work. Statistical studies, long-term statistical studies of this, have shown us that happiness does not increase over time. It goes back to the same level. For example, the study in France, after mandatory government reduction of hours, saw a return to the same level of happiness after 7 years. And if you want to see those same employees really stressed out, just see what happens when their employers lay them off to hire part-time workers instead, or have to close their doors because they cannot make enough revenue. Another major flaw in these studies is the self-selection bias. For example, the companies that choose to participate in some of these studies, like the 4-Day Week Global Study, are companies whose work tend to be able to be adapted to a shorter work week already, who can remove, quote, wasted hours. It is specifically only companies that are able to adapt to shorter work week that tend to participate, cutting out, as they say, extraneous meetings, coffee breaks, having more independent work, going to Zoom. However, over 70% of the US job economy is people working with their hands. They don't necessarily have extraneous meetings or too many coffee breaks to cut out. So statistically, you can't apply this type of cutting of hours across the entire economy. Also, given the types of companies that are potentially capable of cutting their work week, we could see a divide of the rich getting richer, having more time, and the poor needing to take on 3 part-time jobs in order to pay the bills. We also potentially disadvantage older workers who cannot necessarily physically do the same amount of work in a shorter time. This happened to the great detriment of that population during the Great Depression. In terms of increased productivity, by shortening the week, the statistics just aren't there, and there are specific studies that show the opposite. Japan tried it, as Dr. Cassidy said, from 1988 to 1996, and the result was not ambiguous. Economic output fell by 20%. Another largely touted study was in Iceland, which had a pilot program cutting the work week by about 4 hours from 2015 to 2019. The results were blasted all over the headlines as this overwhelming success. What is not reported on is that the Icelandic government, or rather taxpayers, now have to shell out almost $30 million extra a year to hire more healthcare workers because of this experiment. In Spain, where there's a pilot program, the companies that participate get access to a multi-million-dollar government fund in order to participate. Microsoft also tested a 4-day work week by shutting down its Japan office every Friday for the month of August. The statistical claim is that this resulted in a 40% increase in productivity. This is a statistical fallacy, that correlation is not necessarily causation. Productivity increased over a very, very short period of time during a low productivity month when overall productivity was already at a 75-year low. There is no statistical evidence to merit a nationwide mandate of a 32-hour work week. And in fact, there's clear evidence against it. If it works for some companies in some sectors, that is great. But it cannot be applied to all sectors. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vittert. Next is Mr. Roger King, a Senior Labor and Employment Counsel at the HR Policy Association, which represents the Chief Human Resource Officers of nearly 400 of the largest businesses. He's highly regarded as a labor relations attorney, career spanning more than 40 years. He began out of law school as a counsel for this committee. He told me he was a peer with Angus King, one of our colleagues, and that he, in his day, worked with Robert Taft Jr., a very young Teddy Kennedy, Jacob Javits, and others. It's like a homecoming week for you. Thanks for being here, Mr. King.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, Dr. Cassidy, members of the committee, it is indeed a distinct honor to come back before this committee again. I had great experiences here working with Robert Taft Jr., Fritz Mondale, Ted Kennedy, Jack Javits, and yes, Angus King and I used to go out for an adult beverage now and then in this community. So thank you again for having me back. And I am appearing here, Dr. Cassidy, as you mentioned, on behalf of the HR Policy Association. We represent approximately 10% of the private sector workers in this country through our corporate members. I'd like to start the discussion about mandating 32 hours, over 8 hours, over 12 hours. These are concepts that have consequences. This proposal only works if you reduce 8 hours a work week and have the workers have the same level of productivity that they had at 40 hours. It just doesn't work in many industries. It doesn't work economically, it doesn't work operationally. Then what we have is what I call a productivity gap, where we have work that's not yet getting done for the 32-hour work week situation. How do you fill that productivity gap? And as you mentioned, Senator Cassidy, the inflationary impact of this type of proposal is considerable. I noted this week that the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics said that we have inflation at 3.2%, ticked up from January. Our core inflation is 3.8 or more, well beyond the 2% target rate for the feds. So this is bad policy as it results to the consumer. So what do I mean by that? If you can't fill the productivity gap by cutting back hours or making some adjustments in your business, you pass on added costs to the consumer. You have to pay for it some way. The other very important point I'd like to make at the beginning of my testimony is flexibility is the most important thing that we are hearing from workers today. They want as much flexibility as possible as to how, when, and where they perform work. The proposal of the chairman, in all due respect, is going to interfere with that flexibility. Workers today want to be able to spend more time with their families. They certainly agree with panel witness on that point. They also want to select, though, as I said, when, where, and how they work. Let's go to the history of the Fair Labor Standards Act just for a moment. It's been mentioned already numerous times. If you go back and look at the history of the New Deal and why President Franklin Roosevelt was initiating this proposal, it was to increase the number of jobs in the country. The evidence is clear. That proposal was put in place by the Congress to increase the number of Americans to come to the workplace. What we are seeing today in the proposal of the chairman really
a real problem for our country. We already have a tremendous shortage of workers. Industry after industry doesn't have enough workers today. This proposal for many employers will cause even further worker shortages. The flexibility factor is a problem. Now, we do commend the chairman and this committee for having a hearing on the impact of AI. It is considerable. And Senator Cassidy, I think your suggestion for a bipartisan discussion is excellent. We would welcome that. There's no question AI can increase productivity. And there's no question that increased wealth can occur. It's what I call the AI dividend wealth. And we agree that workers and employers alike should share in that wealth. But the way to go about that is let the market determine that distribution of wealth. If Mr. Fain's union can negotiate a 32-hour work week, so be it. If he can convince the auto worker companies in this country to do it, so be it. But let the market determine how the distribution of wealth is to occur. Finally, as an overall point, we commend the committee for starting a discussion about the Fair Labor Standards Act. This is one of the most litigated statutes in the country. Chairman, you're absolutely correct. We need to re-examine it. The amount of litigation that occurs regarding the Fair Labor Standards Act is way over the top. We need to address more clarity in this statute. I've listed in my testimony a number of problems with the 32-hour work week. I would close with this comment. I just saw the senator's bill last night, and it is even more extreme than I had thought we were going to be discussing today. The requirement to pay overtime over 8 hours will be a significant economic adverse impact on many companies. And the requirement to pay double time over 12 hours, I think the only state in the country that does that is California. That, from our perspective, is quite extreme. One last point on an example, just to bring this home. Healthcare employers in this country generally employ registered nurses for 3 12-hour shifts. So it's not just 4 hours, they've gone to 3 work days. But there are 12-hour shifts, and that works by and large. But this proposal would require between that 36 and 32 hour, 4 additional hours of overtime. And additionally, it would require overtime over 8. That's going to have a very negative impact on the healthcare community in this country and cause healthcare expenses to go up. The solution for the healthcare community is to get more nurses, more workers into the employment stream, not to impose strict standards that will cripple employers and cause incremental costs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all of the panelists. Let me just briefly respond to Mr. King's statement about letting the market decide who benefits from the transition to more advanced technology. For the last 50 years, the market has done just that. And the result has been there has been a $50 trillion transfer of wealth from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. So after those 50 years, there are millions of workers today who are worse off, while we have more income and wealth inequality than we've ever had in the history of the country. So I am not quite in favor of letting the market decide. All right, let me begin the questioning. We're going to be a little bit, not to offend Senator Cassidy, a little bit liberal here in terms of the time, because we only have a few members here and it's an important subject. I wanted to start off with President Fain. And I don't want to talk about statistics. We've heard a lot of statistics. You've been with the union for over 3 decades. No doubt, as president, you've met thousands of workers, you've met thousands of retirees. Tell the American people what it's like to work on a factory floor. In some cases, I mean, by the way, I learned this recently. There are people today in America who are working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. Unbelievable. But President Fain, talk about the impact on the life of a worker mentally, physically, who is doing work hard work day after day, year after year? What happens to that person?
Thank you. So, you know, I find irony in some of the statements I just listened to, but so, you know, the typical life of a factory worker, I mean, and this is union or not, and it's actually worse for non-union workers because they have less rules that govern their workplace. But, you know, when you're, you know, typically many factory workers, many typical schedules in manufacturing are 12-hour schedules, and they're 7 days a week. A lot of these places run around the clock. When you are standing on concrete floors 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, year after year after year, there's a lot of wear and tear on a person's body. As I say, people when they age, you know, they end up, you know, in their older working years, end up getting knee replacements, hip replacements, shoulder surgeries. You know, but I just find an irony in some of this that, you know, mentally, the stress of working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. You know, when you don't get to see your kids, you don't get to go home and have dinner with your kids, you don't get to make sure they're getting their homework done, you don't get to spend quality time with family, or just even if you don't have a family, if you have quality time for yourself. You know, something sacrificed when you're working 12 hours a day, either sleep or time with family, something else is sacrificed. We only have so much time in a day. But, you know, I find an irony in some of the comments that were made by Mr. King as far as the shortage of workers. You know, I don't believe we have a shortage of workers in this country. I think COVID made people wake up and realize what's important in life. And it's not working for $12 an hour and 12 hours a day and multiple jobs to struggle to get by. So this shortage of workers that we see, I don't believe it's a shortage. I believe it's a fact that people have woke up and they decided, I'm not going to leave my home for $12 an hour when I can't even afford to pay the bills. And also, you know, going back to, you know, letting the markets determine this, and it's just an HR standard talking point about passing added cost on to the consumer. Well, I witnessed inflation the last 4 years. That wasn't caused by workers. It was caused by two words: corporate greed. It was consumer price gouging. And so, you know, that to me, we got to get focused on the reality here.
Thank you. Dr. Schor, we are the wealthiest country in the history of the world, and yet we have people who are stressed out. We have a crisis in mental health, a lot of factors for that, and yet we are working longer hours, as I understand it, than people of any other wealthy nation. How does that happen?
Well, I think a lot of the reason for the long hours in this country have to do with the kinds of things that we've been talking here today, and the fact that the American worker has not had enough power in the market to reduce hours. But there are other aspects as well. One of the things we know from economic studies is that when inequality increases, so do working hours. And so the rise in inequality in the United States, which you referred to earlier, is one of the primary causes of longer working hours in the United States.
Okay. Mr. Leland, from your perspective, this discussion is not just theoretical. You have implemented it. Talk a little bit about the impact that has had the transition to a 4-day work week in your company, the impact that it's had on the workers there.
Yeah, I mean, it's been transformative for our workers. I mean, I've been told that this is one of the most impactful things that they've experienced in their lives, because a lot of these workers are able to spend time with their kids. They are learning new skills. I have someone who works for me who learned how to use AI on those days off and has brought it back into the workplace and is much more efficient as a result. They are learning new skills that are not related to work, but are just participating in their communities, volunteering.
We talk about increased productivity. Are workers more focused when they come back after 3 days
Yes.
off?
Yeah, so workers are much more focused, that they are better rested, they are dedicated to the task at hand in a different way, and teams stay together longer. everywhere. The cohesiveness of the organization is much more robust on a 4-day work week because you aren't burning people out, you aren't churning through them, you aren't having to deal with turnover costs.
We'll talk about turnover. I mean, one of the great costs to businesses is a lot of turnover and having to train new workers. What do you think the impact of a 32-hour work week would be on that?
It was shocking, honestly, how much it changed turnover and what impact that had on our productivity. I mean, honestly, we've rarely lost an employee in the last 2 years. That means people have longer tenure. We don't have to deal with hiring, the cost of hiring, the time of hiring someone else. Our goals don't get disrupted by the sudden departure of a key employee. I think a 32-hour work week, people want to work. The notion that, I don't know, Americans are lazy, that some people seem to have, is, I think, inaccurate. People want to work, but they want to work in a way that is balanced with the rest of their lives. And they will stay in those jobs longer if the job is balanced with the rest of their lives.
Thanks very much. Senator Cassidy?
I yield to Senator Braun.
Thank you. So, before I got here, 37 years spent running an enterprise that would encompass that scrappy navigation of how hard it is when you're signing the front side of a paycheck to get a little business, to ever get beyond that. As we grew into a regional, then national company, things change as you evolve. And we've had discussions before. I'm a proponent of high wages and good benefits. Been out there to where you ought to be able to negotiate and bargain, but there's such a big difference in terms of that dynamic, and then wrapping it with mandates that would never enable most of what comprises our economy, which would be small businesses, Main Street ones, to be in a position to where they'd have to live with some type of homogenous approach to maybe even what we're talking about. And I think even for most business owners, if they can, they're going to weave that into what they're able to offer their employees. And Mr. Fain, we've had the conversation. Big corporations that are in places where they've cornered the market, I think there's a legitimate discussion of how you spread that wealth within between employees and public companies, and a lot of times the professional management that would seem to, rake in levels of pay that I never thought were possible. I want to get back to, though, how I do disagree with trying to do anything from this place that would impose upon the preponderance of businesses out there to where I just don't think they could survive. I think that it's a legitimate issue to talk about voluntarily, and if you're good at what you do and you're going to keep employees, you're going to want to weave it in. I think it's a legitimate issue to bargain for at that highest level of super large corporations and large workforces. I think that's about as far as you can go. Most businesses would not be like yours, Mr. Leland. There is more, you wouldn't be in business if you weren't open 6 days a week for almost any retail business I'm aware of, including my wife's business in our downtown that's been there for now nearly 45 years. It just would not work. Keep that in mind. I want to start with this particular question for Dr. Vittert and Mr. King, and I want to focus on how this would work on Main Street and with small businesses. I'm not worried about big corporations. They generally are going to land on their feet anyway, and I believe they ought to be negotiated with for all the things you might do to improve the position of a worker there. But what about Main Street and small business? We'll start with you, Dr. Vittert, you start, and then Mr. King.
Pardon me, sorry. I should learn to mute and Zoom. I should have gotten there at this point. I think it's really important to note that so many of these studies that have been done and these pilots that have shown incredible things, what's done at Kickstarter is amazing, is that it is self-selection. These companies are choosing to be a part of this. And so they are able to cut out extraneous meetings. They are able to shorten coffee breaks. They are able to go to remote meetings for some things so you don't have to commute, whatever it is.
And I've never heard of anything that you've just mentioned in a small business.
Exactly.
That just is not there. We try to do it. And so we don't run out of time, because I do have a final question for Mr. Leland. Mr. King, would you weigh in on that too?
Senator, it's good to see you again. This doesn't work for small business. It doesn't work for any type of business. If you can't measure productivity correctly and then have that productivity gap satisfied. The proposal that the chairman is putting in legislation today would require overtime over 8. It would require overtime over 32. It would require overtime double time, in fact, over 12. So a small business needs to have flexibility. Employees have family obligations. They have other obligations in their community. The employer needs them sometimes more than 8, sometimes less. You know that from your business. The bill we're talking about here today interferes with that flexibility. It just is not sound policy.
Thank you. Mr. Leland, would you agree that your business has certain characteristics that probably made it peculiar to you being able to do that? Or do you honestly believe that would be transferable into the multitude of businesses, especially out on Main Street?
Yeah, no, I mean, our business definitely has characteristics that are not unique, but lend themselves towards an easier transition to a 4-day work week. However, the pilots that Dr. Schor has worked on show that this is possible across multiple industries. It looks different, that transformation looks different, but we have seen manufacturing, construction, healthcare, police departments all do this successfully.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for convening this hearing. I think this is a really important conversation to have, regardless of where you stand on this issue. And I think the fundamental question here that we're asking is, where has all this wealth gone that has been gathered in this economy from these massive increases in productivity? If it hasn't been going to workers, if the UAW and other unions have to fight tooth and nail just to be able to get living wage increases. I will tell you something we haven't talked about yet. A lot of that money is going to trust funds. A lot of that money is going into inherited wealth. And at some point, we should have a conversation about that a little bit more openly as a committee and as a Congress. Here's a stunning piece of data. For the first time last year, the majority of wealth for new billionaires, these were people who became billionaires in 2023, came not from their work, but through inheritance. It's the first time ever that that's happened. 1,000 billionaires are expected to pass down $5.2 trillion worth of wealth to their heirs in the next 20 years. And so you hope that if the money isn't going to the workers, it's at least being recycled back into the economy. It's just not true. A lot of that money is being hoarded and then passed down to kids who, in previous ages would not have been able to enjoy that level of benefit from their parents' success. Mr. Fain, I wanted to talk to you just a little bit about leisure time. You've talked about this already. I think you really importantly talk about the importance that your faith plays in the work that you do in your life. There's a pretty wild thing happening in America today. In 2000, 70% of Americans belong to a religious institution, but today that number is 50%. This has been a pretty precipitous decline in the ability or willingness of Americans to go to church or to a religious institution on a regular basis. And I think that has lots of broad impacts in our society. But there are a lot of reasons for that. But one of them is that Americans just have less free time. When you have to work 70 hours to get the same standard of living for your family that 40 hours would have gotten you a few decades ago, you don't have time to go to Wednesday night Bible study. You might not have the ability to even attend church or services on a Sunday. You can talk about church if you want or if you don't want. But it is just true that some of the leisure time activities, some of the institutions that Americans found value and meaning in are less accessible when you have to work these long hours. I'd love to just hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things we talked about with the 32-hour work week when we put that in our contract talks, was the fact that we wanted to create work-life balance. Because it's just, in this country, we are the most productive, I mean, sadly, I say, not proudly, sadly, we are the most productive nation in the world, which means our people are working more and more hours with less and less people, and something's got to give. And so, it's work-life balance. And as I say, when you're working multiple jobs to live paycheck to paycheck, or you're working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, something else is sacrificed in that, and it's what ends up happening. You have to sacrifice, the ability to go to church. If it's something else to do on a Sunday, maybe you get a Sunday off and you haven't slept all week and you spend the whole day sleeping. I mean, that is a reality a lot of workers face on some of the schedules they work. The thing to me that I think, I hear all this, we've heard my whole life about good for business is good for people, trickle-down economics and all those type things. But to me, we have to focus. I do believe Congress has an obligation here in spending priorities and regulations. And that may be an ugly word to some people that represent business. But, the point of this is this should be done to create more jobs at a better rate of pay so that people have more free time to live. And, if government's going to invest in business, the trillions of dollars we invest in business, that our taxpayer dollars invest in business, those benefits should be going to working class people, not just strictly business. And that's the problem. All this money goes to business, but it never seems to funnel its way down to benefit working class people.
Well, listen, I agree with you. I think we should have an interest in leisure time, right? We should have an interest in making sure that people are able to find value outside of work. A lot of people find value in work, and I'm glad that they do, but a lot of people find more value by the institutions and the social clubs and the churches that they affiliate and spend time with outside of work. But that is just less accessible for people today, and that should be a public policy interest of the United States Congress, and I appreciate this hearing allowing us to talk about that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Cassidy?
Yes, thank you. Although we have a little extra time, we've got a lot of questions, so I'll ask you all to be tight with your questions. First, Mr. Fain, I totally agree with you. My practice as a physician was in a hospital for the uninsured. Folks want jobs and they want decent pay. I agree with that entirely. There's a little bit of confusion in what we're saying. I just want to put out some of that confusion. When you say people are working longer to make more money, well, if you just cut them down to 32 hours a week, they're still making the same money. So for them to grow their income, they would have to either work overtime and or take a second job. And yes, there's companies that work 24/7, but the people don't work 24/7. They work 40 hours a week, or apparently on average 41.3 hours per week. So I think we have to be kind of clear on that. And lastly, of course, productivity is not more hours to make the same money. Productivity is more work per hour. And it's oftentimes aided by machines, in which case there's less wear and tear on the body. Not to say that there's not wear and tear on the body. We think of construction workers, but still, that's the whole point. So, Dr. Schor, when you mentioned that decreasing hours worked per week increases productivity, it makes total sense to me. When I go to Spain and go to McDonald's, they don't have somebody at the front desk to take my order for a hamburger. They've got a machine that I push a button on and it dispenses it. And our Department of Labor has said that if we raise minimum wage, there'll be a net loss of jobs because people will automate in order to decrease their labor cost. So how would, if you're speaking of a service industry, why would raising their labor costs by having fewer hours worked per week for the same salary be any different than raising the minimum wage in terms of an incentive for a net loss of jobs by replacing workers with automation?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Let me just respond.
Real quick.
Yeah, 2 points. One is we're seeing no increase in overtime, in second job holding in our studies, by the way. But the impacts that we're seeing here are not labor displacing because people are able to make up that productivity in the 4 days that they had in the 5 days. Yes.
That surprises me because I just intuitively, I'm a doctor, so I intuitively when I read about the temple nurses working shorter hours, I'll just say that according to the Pennsylvania Hospital Association, 30% of RN positions are unfilled. And apparently Temple University Hospital spent $55 million for nurse overtime because of a nursing shortage. So I'm not sure how to square that because they worked less hours, but they had to pay more for overtime and/or for others.
These are for their nurse managers because the other nurses are on these like 3-day schedules and so forth. So, and this was put into place at 2 years after the pandemic started.
So the nurse managers are working less, not the RNs themselves.
Correct.
Okay. Well,
so they haven't, because they're not on 5-day schedules, so they haven't.
I'm almost out of time. I'm going to move. Mr. Leland, right now we're trying to get a health bill. The best I can tell, my staff is working 80 hours a week. Because anytime they call me on a Saturday or a Sunday or a Monday on a holiday, they're fully prepared and obviously there. When y'all have got a big crunch time, deadline has to hit, boom, you got to move. Like people still only work 32 hours?
No, it's a norm, right? This is not pencils down at 32 hours. It is the question of, well, what is your standard work week that you're flexing
Got it.
out?
That's all I was going to check. Dr. Vittert, I look at France's unemployment rate among the youth. It's like 17%. It's pretty amazing. And then for the next group, it's like 7 or 8%, much higher than ours. And you had mentioned, and they've got other labor laws as well, but you had mentioned that this kind of, sugar high, more satisfaction, but then it evades and then it goes away, but also that there's a loss of work as workers either go to temporary workers or offshore. Could you elaborate on that, please?
I think it's the same kind of idea as right when COVID hit, we're all baking bread or doing whatever we're doing, and then as COVID went on longer and you're at home more, you're sitting in your bed longer. It shows in the long-term studies that things just go back to normal. We just see that happen all over again with people. And I think we see it clearly in terms of unemployment rates in the same way.
So if you will, the other things that occur, the disruption in the economy, et cetera, really have more to dictate your happiness than whether or not you work a little less. And indeed, there may be a loss of a job because of this impact upon you.
And that's exactly what happened in France, as people lost their jobs.
Gotcha. And Mr. King, just to make the point, there is nothing to prevent a business like Mr. Leland or Temple University Hospital for a select group of employees to have a policy which would be 32 hours a week. So there's no reason for a mandate per se. Companies can do that, just to make that point.
Yeah, absolutely, Senator. And that's the point. Let's give flexibility to workers and to employers. Don't have government come in and intervene. It's going directly in the opposite position of where we should be going. Now, as far as the number of workers available in this country, I agree with Mr. Fain. We need to get more people back into the workforce, for sure. But study after study shows, even if we did that, and I'm looking at a recent U.S. Chamber of Commerce study, we'd still have 3 million jobs open in this country. This proposal is going in the wrong direction. Flexibility is what we need.
And Dr. Vittert, Dr. Schor, first I'm going to ask you this, then go back to Dr. Vittert. You had mentioned, I didn't quite get the association versus causation. You say that when there's more inequality, that people work longer hours. I didn't quite understand that relationship. Is that an association or a causation?
These are done with macroeconomic studies, so we believe they're causation, but they're not controlled experiments, and that's...
Dr. Vittert, any comment?
If you don't have a controlled experiment, you cannot find causation. It's just statistics.
Yeah, I once gave a vaccine to a person who became pregnant, and it made me realize that, just because it happens at the same time, it's not a causation, it is an association.
Yes, but these are highly sophisticated studies, and I really would disagree with the idea that we can only know something if we
Yeah,
have
but I
an
don't understand
experiment.
intuitively why it would happen, but I'm out of time.
Oh.
Yeah.
Because people need to work more hours to keep up. Because there's a comparative dimension to the way people's sense of what is
I'm not sure that the
is.
thing of milk costs more because somebody else is making more, but that's another story. Yes.
Senator Hickenlooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I've been looking forward all day to this, just because it's such a great group of panel. I appreciate all your time and contribution. Mr. Fain, it's great to see you again. I appreciate all the work that you did to bring up a 4-day week and the negotiations, but I'm going to hold off on yours just because I have to start with Dr. Schor, who was an undergraduate student while I was a graduate student, and somehow she hasn't aged, whereas I have, and I think there's an injustice there that needed to be pointed out. But appreciate all your work and research over all these years on the lives people lead in various types of jobs. You talk a little bit about the different ways that people have a shorter work week, taking part off every day or a whole day time each month off. What are some of the pros, and again, concisely, because I got several questions, but pros and cons on this?
Yes, the majority in our studies, and thank you, by the way, really wonderful to see you, are doing full days off. So over 90% of our studies are doing full days off, and that seems to be a much more popular way to do this than shorter daily hours, although there's a little bit of variation. One thing we looked at in our studies was whether or not having 3 consecutive days had a bigger impact on well-being, and we were surprised that it doesn't. In some of them, people are taking those Wednesdays off to get a break in the middle of the week.
Interesting. And better or worse for small businesses?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. Over 70% of the businesses in our US and Canada sample have fewer than 25 employees. So I think this is proving to be an especially appealing thing for small businesses. And it may have to do with higher levels of stress that they're seeing among their employees. I mean, one of the things we're seeing is the small number of companies who are discontinuing. We're trying to figure out what's common among them. And so far, the only thing we can see is they're not achieving the same levels of well-being increase that the ones who don't stop are.
Interesting. When I was mayor, when I first became mayor of Denver in 2003, we had the worst budget recession ever. And one of the stopgap measures we did was we compelled all city employees to take Friday afternoons off, unpaid. Needless to say, that was not perfect. No one likes to, when you're on a tight budget, to have to make your budget bounce at the end of the month. But people really liked it. And, to this day, that's to give people that Friday off every week. We saw an increase in sales at local restaurants, which was interesting, and other retail sales went up. So there's some accessory benefit. Mr. Leland, I'm going to skip past you, although I can't tell you how excited I am to have the chief vision officer for Kickstarter, because I admire so much of what you all have done. I want to go to Dr. Vittert, just because I found compelling that she was, in 2018, the coolest person in Scotland, and that her television show, Liberty's Great American Cookbook, which is it still showing in Scotland?
It is.
It's still showing in Scotland. It was
I
something.
need all the viewers I can get.
Yes. Well, we want to make sure we don't miss to promote that, because when I was the mayor and working through that, and I looked this up last night when I saw, because Vittert's not a common name, and it's interesting that she seemed to the left of Mr. Leland, because her brother Leland Vittert was a journalist with an internationally successful and admired journalist with Foxback. He's based in Denver when I first became mayor. So he's schooled me he educated me within the School of Hard Knocks on how to think about these things. Anyway, Dr. Vittert, one argument in favor of implementing a 32-hour work week is that these tech advancements like AI are going to make such a dramatic increase. How realistic do you think that is, and when would those productivity increases begin to show or begin to have a benefit?
I think the issue that we see here is people use the word AI and don't necessarily know what that means. And that as someone who works in this space, we don't know yet what abilities AI is going to give us, or machine learning. I mean, we're still trying to figure out what those words even really mean. So to say that there's going to be this explosion of productivity and wealth, we just don't know yet. And no one's saying, or I'm certainly not saying, it's above my pay grade, that people shouldn't share in that. But mandating a reduction to a 32-hour work week is not the way to do that.
Got it. I hear that. And Mr. King, same question to you, because I think you've probably got a little more gone into AI on a little bit of deeper level. What's your feeling on that?
A tremendous opportunity for everybody, absolutely. But the issue of distribution of wealth, the wealth dividend, Senator, from AI, I know that's what we're really talking about here. I would point the committee's attention to chart 1 in my testimony. Productivity and compensation have tracked similarly for decades. Economists agree on that. Now, there have been gaps in different industries. There's been time lags, Senator, but the market will solve this issue. Mr. Fain will negotiate hard for 32 hours, I'm sure. Others will advocate for 32 hours. We have examples that we see work, but let the market decide this. Don't have Congress impose this on employers or employees.
Got it. Great. And then, since I can go over just for a minute, Mr. Fain, when you were negotiating and introduced this notion of a 32-hour work week, I mean, you've talked firsthand with the large employers and large group of employees. It ultimately wasn't included in the final contract, but what were some of the concerns, not the unique concerns that we haven't heard before that were raised by the employers, and what do you think it would take to get those employers to move? I think in terms of the 36-hour work week that we tried when I was mayor of the city, it's really like roughly a 10% pay raise. Is the way to think about doing something like that. The level of appreciation of people having that Friday afternoon off was palpable. You could feel it. Anyway, what was your sense on that?
Well, I think it's just obviously I think it's just a fear of change, of something, doing something different. I mean, you look at, there are studies that have been done when workers, especially factory workers, manufacturing, when they work anything after 10 hours typically is they're not as productive. It just, the wear and tear that you go throughout the day, there have been a lot of studies done on that, that productivity actually drops off. So there are benefits to shorter working hours. And as a person who stood on a line, as an 18-year-old, I can vividly remember putting a part on a transmission. I would sit there, it's monotonous work, doing it over and over and over. And, literally after 2 hours of that, you're just, your mind's wandering off. And imagine doing that for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. There are a lot of benefits to having, some semblance of work-life balance. But unfortunately, with the advances in technology, the companies choose to eliminate jobs and squeeze more and more people, the remaining people, working more and more hours, and that just doesn't work.
Right, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I've got many more questions which I'll throw in writing, but I'll yield back to the chair. Thank you all again for being here.
Thank you, Senator Kelly.
I said hi.
Senator Cassidy has asked unanimous consent to enter into the record a number of statements without objection. Mr. King, you can inform your clients that our legislation probably will not be passing tomorrow.
Thank you. They'll be glad to hear that.
I'm sure they will. But the point of this hearing is to try to raise at the congressional level something that has not been discussed here for decades after decades. And I think as all of us have understood, we are living in a difficult moment in American history. We have more income and wealth inequality than we have ever had before. Senator Murphy made the interesting point that for the billionaire class, now a majority of that wealth is being not earned by any case, but being transferred to children, unearned income, if you like. We're seeing CEOs making 350 times more than their workers, while 60% of the people in America are living paycheck to paycheck. We have the highest level of childhood poverty of almost any major country on earth. Many of our older people finding it hard to retire. So we've got to start asking some fundamental questions. This is an extraordinary wealthy country. but 3 people on top, as Mr. Fain mentioned, own more wealth than the bottom half of American society, according to the RAND Corporation over the last 50 years. And RAND Corporation is not exactly a socialist organization. Over the last 50 years, $50 trillion has gone from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. So in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, the vast majority of our people are struggling to put food on the table, are living under incredible stress. Our life expectancy is significantly lower, as you know, than other countries. And for working class people, if you're working class in this country, you're going to live 10 years fewer than you will if you are upper class. These are issues that have got to be discussed. I'm not suggesting that a 32-hour work week is going to change all of that. But one of the issues that we have got to talk about is stress in this country. The fact that so many people are going to work exhausted, physically and mentally. And the fact that we have not changed the Fair Labor Standards Act. This was in 1940. We came up with a 40-hour work week. 1940. Who is going to deny that the economy has not fundamentally and radically changed over that period of time? So to suggest that we have to maintain what we put in place 84 years ago does not make a lot of sense to me. So let me just conclude by thanking all of our excellent panelists. It's been a good discussion. I hope the discussion continues. And thank you all very much for being here today. For any senators who wish to ask additional questions for the record will be due in 10 business days. I ask unanimous consent to enter the record 2 statements in support of shortened work weeks, including a statement from Congressman Takano and business owners across the country. The committee stands adjourned.